I'm so grateful, actually. This is one of the only days off I've had for about 6 months because I've been looking for this missing woman who started an enormous cryptocurrency scam. This is on topic, trust me. But it's reflecting on that recently. It's very, very weirdly familiar probably to some of you in the audience because this woman started up a cryptocurrency scam and the regulators weren't exactly sure quite who was responsible for this brand new financial instrument. So it kind of fell between the cracks. And for many, many months, even years, no one quite knew what to do about it. And all the time that the regulators weren't explicitly outlawing this, the people that were promoting this scam were constantly saying that the inaction from the authorities was proof of its legitimacy. And that is, I'm not going to go too much into the similarities, but I'm sure some of you are roughly familiar with that kind of problem. But I've been doing that for 6 months, and this is the day off I have because I really, really wanted to come and speak to you about this, so I'm so grateful that you have me here. And I could talk about the things I've written about in the past to do with data and privacy. I'm sure, though, that you have all heard many times. Brad talked about it very well, about how data rights are human rights, they're foundational rights, about the problems of large technology monopolies and what that could do, the issue to do with surveillance, capitalism. But I think you've heard all of this stuff many, many times. So I'd rather try to take a slightly different approach and just imagine some of the trends that we see at the moment rolled forward 10 or 15 years from now and get you to try to imagine how some of the challenges that we see at the moment will look in 10 or 15 years' time, because I think in 10 or 15 years' time, people are going to be relying on some of you to solve those problems and probably will have expected you to have been thinking about them today. How many challenges are there to do with data and privacy that we always say now, if only we'd have started on this 10 years ago, we might have been able to do something slightly better. So I thought I would take a couple of examples and roll them forward. And we'll start with the story, of course, the most famous story in this world of Cambridge Analytica, because I covered it in some detail for the BBC a couple of years ago. And I don't need to go back into all the details of that story, of course. But I want you to try to think about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and elections, not as what happened in 2016, as some kind of template for, or I suppose, to worry too much about what happened in 2016. I want instead for you to think about this as a new departure about how all elections will look and how an election might look on the same path if we carry on by 2030. And I use that date because I often think to myself, the first time I voted in an election was about 15 or 20 years ago now. And if anybody had have told me back then, in the late 1990s, that in 15 or so years' time, elections will be fought on a free social media platform called Facebook, which is based on some profiling about you from all sorts of data brokerage companies where data's been collected from your online behavior and then used to target you with adverts. I mean, this sounded like science fiction. Nobody would have believed it. So I want you to try to think about how will an election look in 10 or 15 years from now. And there are a few things, I think, that are pretty obvious. The first is that much more profiling and much better computing or more powerful computing power will, of course, mean that more and more profiling about people not only takes place, but is more inferred. It will be all about patterns of people's behaviors, essentially trying to work out things about each of us that we ourselves have never explicitly said. This was the idea behind psychographics, the idea that you could profile people's personalities based on their Facebook likes, which I don't think actually really works that well at all. But I think probably will start working quite well in around 10 years' time and will be used as part of a much broader suite of techniques which are known as inferred profiling. And inferred profiling, of course, is this kind of inequality of power between what you know about yourself and what somebody trying to profile you knows about you. And it won't just be psychographics trying to work out people's personality types. The most exciting part of all of this, I think, is some people call it affective or emotional profiling. Can we start to work out people's emotional states based on the little wrinkles in their faces, based on their tiny smiles and small facial gestures? Yes, in 10 or 15 years' time, of course, we will be able to. I'm terrified about going into a shop one day to think about trying on a jacket that I kind of like but don't want to spend. But in fact, the person in the shop knows full well that I want to buy it because they've already got the information about my slight change in my facial tone or heart rate to be able to determine that I will be back in that shop in 10 minutes to purchase that. These techniques becoming fairly standard, as I'm sure they will of course be integrated into political campaigning in exactly the same way. So it's inferred profiling, and alongside that, of course, is far greater personalized profiling. So rather than being in a bucket of lots of different people and receiving adverts based on the bucket that you are in, of course, in a decade or so, we can imagine that every single person in this room will receive a completely different message, personalized entirely to you and your current mood to everybody else in the room. Total personalization of content. And I assume more and more machine-generated adverts and content. Because after all, if you're going to run millions of adverts to millions of people which change every few minutes depending on their mood, that's far too much for anyone to craft. You'll need more and more machines to do it for you. So imagine an election in 2030 when we have far more inferred profiling, based, of course, on your diet, on your coffee consumption that morning. So when you get up in the morning and you go down and get your coffee from your smart coffee machine, assuming it hasn't already been hacked into by somebody who's trying to charge you a Bitcoin to be able to unlock your coffee machine, which will also be happening, assuming that all works, of course, that will be going into a profile about you that will be incorporated into 25 years now worth of YouTube viewing habits. And if you're 20 years old, that will, of course, include all the things that you clicked on as a toddler that you didn't even really know why you were watching. And then when, in 2030, the election comes around and we have these personalized, perfectly personalized adverts that are mood-dependent, that are generated by machine, and that are based on 20 years' worth of your personalized data, the adverts will be coming at you. So you'll go to your fridge at 6 p.m. because you're slightly hungry, but we know that people at 6 p.m. who are hungry are slightly angry because they're hungry, because we've checked all this over 1 million different data points. And you go to open your fridge and you think you're going to get a can of Coke out, but oh no, up pops an advert from a politician targeting an advert at you just about your mood that day and something that happened to you earlier. This is the future of an election. This is no stranger than trying to describe what happened in 2016 would have sounded if I tried to tell you about this 15 years ago. This is the inevitable future of elections. And you know what? I don't even think the question is whether this is going to work, whether this is going to be effective or not. I'm not sure. I think often enough a lot of this is overhyped. It doesn't work as well as its salespeople say. The question is, will people believe in an election that is run according to those kinds of principles? Will the regulations and the laws we have about elections be sufficient for people to think that this is a free and fair election? How do the regulators run an election in a free and fair way when every single person receives different messages every day, millions of messages that will be posted online or targeted online at people through personalized devices and often machine-generated? I don't think we're really ready for that yet. And the thing that worries me, and I think this has been the story of the last 3 or 5 years in people's trust in elections, is whether or not they believe. It gets a lot easier, put it this way, it gets a lot easier to accuse the other side of cheating when nobody believes that anybody's really watching, when nobody believes that anybody's really able to monitor properly the way that our elections work. And so everywhere now that I look, I see that more maybe than the rise of these techniques is the rise of accusations of cheating Those adverts were untrue. You profiled people in this way. You shouldn't have collected this data about person X, Y, or Z, with the aim, of course, potentially not on purpose, of undermining people's confidence in elections. So this is the sort of challenge that we have. I think in the next 10 years or so, the great challenge is a kind of incompatibility between the laws and the regulations that we have and the way that digital technology is changing society. Many of the problems we face today come down to that, and possibly no more so than in something like an election. So that's just for one example that's very topical. But there are many others, because every problem starts to become a data problem when data is pervasive and everywhere. So I want you to consider some of the other things that you might have to deal with. And one of them, I think, is going to be what happens when machines make more and more autonomous decisions that affect people's lives. This is why, by the way, I think possibly the single most important part of the GDPR in the next 10 years might not be about subject access requests. I think it's going to be about trying to the clauses that are about explaining machine decisions to people, how machines arrive at decisions that materially affect people's lives. And the more these machines make decisions about our lives that affect our lives, the more we as citizens will want to know why and how that has happened. So let me give you a couple of examples. I don't know how many of you use Spotify or any of the other music streaming services, but Spotify's algorithms are getting a lot better. Have you noticed? The recommendations that they make to me are getting better and better. And so the other day, it's recommending me a song, great, and then it recommends me U2. And I was sort of actually a little bit upset. I was quite offended. I don't know if they're sorry for any U2 fans in the building. But I found myself a little bit distraught. U2? I don't like U2. I hate U2. How could Spotify think that I would be a fan of this band? I'm going to email the ICO and see what they can do about this. I didn't do that because I know they're busy enough already with slightly more important things. But then I thought to myself, maybe I do like U2. And Spotify knows that I do, and I'm lying to myself about it. Why am I doing this? These are the kinds of things that are going to become daily occurrences. I think long before machines start taking all of our jobs, they will be rude to us and mean to us and accidentally cruel to us and offend and upset us. And these are things that will actually start to matter to people. Not the U2 example, but what about when it becomes serious forms of discrimination that occur because of how a machine has responded to something? Well, then that starts to get far more serious, and I believe far more widespread. And how are people going to understand those decisions clearly? But what about when it gets even more serious? Like, for example, recently in the UK, the Secretary of State for Health, I think it was 2 years ago, Jeremy Hunt, stood up in the House of Commons and said that several 100,000 women weren't given breast cancer screening appointments at the right time because, and I quote, a computer algorithm failure. And he said that several people's lives may have been shortened as a result of a computer algorithm failure. I am very worried that a computer algorithm failure is going to become the politician's non-apology of choice in future. Because increasingly, by the way, when they ran a kind of investigation into this, they found that not one person could be held responsible. All of our social systems are often designed to ensure that individuals are held responsible for these things. That's how we understand responsibility. But who do you hold responsible when some algorithm has made an error? The person that designed the algorithm 5 years ago in good faith? The people that fed the data into the algorithm in good faith? The people who acted upon that believing that the machine was accurate because it's been accurate in the past? These are going to become extremely big problems for all of us. The danger here, I think, is, again, it's partly that in the Anglo-Saxon world, we often think about two major writers who set out our fearful, terrifying dystopian future. George Orwell, who writes about a surveillance state and how we'll be monitored and books will be banned and television will be banned and will be constantly spied on. And that's the Orwellian vision. And then on the other hand, we have Aldous Huxley, who said, we won't need to ban televisions or books because nobody will want to read them because they'll all be spending their time being too amused, taking silly drugs or being entertained. So we'll wish away our freedom that way voluntarily because we're too entertained by modern gadgets. And people argue about which of those two thinkers are right. Weirdly, to me, it feels like they're simultaneously both right, but that's a different question. But there's another person who I think might be even more visionary about the future, and that's Franz Kafka, who, of course, writes about an impossible thicket of bureaucracy where everything's complicated, nobody knows how anything works, and the result is just pure confusion for all concerned. I think actually Franz Kafka is probably closer to the money about how things could be in future when people don't understand how decisions are made. And this really worries me. And the reason it worries me is because one of the writers I admire most is Hannah Arendt. I'm sure many of you have read her works, and probably most famously about the banality of evil when she writes about Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief bureaucrats behind the Holocaust. And his argument was always, his defense in his trial was always, I was just following orders. I simply followed what the bureaucracy told me to do. And great acts of evil can be undertaken by people who are simply following orders. And one of the dangers I think that we face in future when it comes to understanding how decisions are made, especially public decisions, will be the ease with which we will all start being able to say we were just following orders because some incredibly intelligent deep learning algorithm had told us that this was the right decision to make. And then the Adolf Eichmann of the future becomes a kind of cool-looking guy in his late 20s with jeans on who works in the data science department. That's the worry that I have about this, which is why explainability of how machines make decisions in future becomes so important as a defense against that. Okay, I'm getting really into my dystopian mood here. Well, I've got one more for you. A few months ago, pop impresario Simon Cowell, sorry for the UK specific references here, but Simon Cowell's a global brand, right? So he's the one that does the X Factor, sits up on one of these chairs and votes on people, how good they are at performing on the stage and so on. A few months ago, he announced that he'd given up his smartphone. He said, it's amazing. He said, I've been months without my smartphone. I feel better, feel clearer-minded. I'm not checking my emails all the time. I'm not constantly on social media to see what's being said about me. I feel fantastic. And I thought to myself, you haven't really given up your smartphone though, have you? What you have done is outsource the functions of the smartphone to people who you can pay to do things for you. Well, he doesn't need an Uber driver because he's got a personal chauffeur. He doesn't need to check his emails because he can get somebody else to do it for him. And it got me thinking about what I believe will become one of the great inequalities of the future. Again, thinking 10 years down the line, that inequality to do with data. Many of us in this room are probably relatively middle class, and we probably worry if we've got children about things like screen time, something I never even thought about 10 years ago. But all of my middle class friends are absolutely petrified now about the fact that their little children might be spending too long on social media or watching the iPad. And they proudly walk around saying, well, my little child doesn't even have a social media account yet, and they don't even watch television at all. They're outside playing on those Swedish wooden toys. Their red faces, happy out in the sunshine, fantastic. And I think this is going to become I can already see it happening, one of the great divides. And I see it with fridges. When I talk about smart fridges during your election, Well, the middle classes won't be worried about smart fridges during an election advertising to them because they'll have non-smart smeg fridges that cost €2,000, thank you very much. And it's fantastic because it doesn't collect any data about me. This issue of a privacy premium, who do you think is going to be paying the lawyers to go to the big technology companies to scrub all the data off their servers about them, or asking them to exercise their data portability rights? It's going to be the people that can afford it. So there'll be simultaneously, of course, the wealthier among us will be able to buy extremely powerful personal assistants that will be able to reverse engineer pricing algorithms, but also will not be collecting data about our every move. And suddenly, a kind of new inequality emerges in society. One, ironically, which is the opposite of that which many of us worried about 10 years ago. The digital divide that I always thought was going to happen would be that the rich would have all this amazing technology and gadgetry, and the poor wouldn't be able to afford it. But I think it starts to feel like the opposite is becoming more and more the case. The rich will be able to exercise their data rights, they will pay for a privacy premium, and the poor won't be able to. And so the rich will walk around the world gracefully, untouched by predatory algorithms, finding it far easier to have a sort of clarity of mind about themselves. The children, the young children with their amazing conversational skills, fantastic, because they're not glued to a screen all day. And that turns into a small advantage in the labor market too, of course, because you can do far better in interviews. This is what I am increasingly worried about now. I think the inequality of the future is not just going to be about stuff and money. It will always be about that too. But it will also be about freedom of mind and clarity of thought and attention. And if that is left purely to the free market, that inequality will grow and will cement other existing inequalities. So these are the three things that keep me up at night, that worry me. Not things that are happening today, but things where I think we can see small clues, small ideas of these problems emerging. And this is why I think it starts being incumbent on some of the people in this room. And this is why I was so delighted to be here, to speak to some of the people in this room about this. Because who else is going to be able to fix these problems? I think in 10 years or so, 15 years or so, when these are the things people are concerned about, their smart fridge election, who can trust in that election, the new inequality to do with data and the privacy premium, they will look to regulators to figure these things out. And they will look to you to figure these things out, because you will be not only the only people that know anything about this, the people that care about data are suddenly responsible for all of these problems, and you will all have 10 years of experience actually trying to deal with these problems, and no one else will. And if we are to, when I try to summarize all these problems, it comes down to a simple thing. It's not to blame technology, but it's to say that there is a growing incompatibility problem with the rules and regulations that we have to make sure our technology works well in society and how that technology is actually functioning. And my fear is this, that people will start to turn against technology in a big way when they don't believe that it's working for them. I don't know if any of you have ever read Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber Manifesto. I know it sounds like a slightly strange suggested reading literature, but might I suggest that you do? Because it is in some places it's terrible and awful, but in other places, and this is by the way written in the mid-1990s, in other places it's scarily prescient about some of the things that we're seeing today. And I can very well imagine in 10, 15, 20 years' time, people begin to turn against technology in a very serious way and begin to see that technology is a force of oppression in society, that it doesn't work for them well anymore. I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and I spent a lot of time with people who were building driverless trucks. Very interesting few weeks I spent over there with them. And they would talk about the amazing future that we have when these trucks hit the road, and they would talk about all the amazing new jobs that they are creating for people. And I would often say the same thing to those brilliant people, very smart people. I'd say the same thing. What is the 50-year-old man who's worked for 30 years as a trucker from North Dakota, who left school at 18, doesn't have a college degree, what job are they supposed to do in this world when we no longer need truckers? And they would always say the same thing. They would always say, well, that person should retrain as a machine learning engineer or a roboticist. And I think, yeah, maybe. It's probably not that realistic, though, is it? What that person will do, of course, is they will be out on the road, that trucker, with a can of spray paint, messing around with the road markings so that the machine learning algorithms that drive the truck gets confused and goes straight through a roundabout. That is what I worry about. That is what happens when people feel that technology is running out of control, that it doesn't work well in their lives. And this is the same whether it's about elections or whether it's about inequality, or just simply how technology works in society today. So I think the job of the regulators is not in any way to be anti-technology at all, and I'm sure none of you are. I think the job is going to be to make sure that people don't become anti-technology. That's the great risk, that unless we are able to control it and shape it in a way that millions of people feel works in their interests, people will turn away from technology, and then all the wonderful benefits that you heard from Brad and from others about this technology would be lost, and that would be a great tragedy. And so I guess it's your job to make sure that doesn't happen. And so with my final word, I guess I would just wish you good luck in that endeavor. And thank you very much for listening.